tecnología. Bueno, me presento, soy Steph, soy parte de Circulated Futures Madrid. En este caso presento yo, porque soy la última en llegar al equipo, como os decía, y mis compis me han dejado que me haga yo rica y famosa aquí en el Zoom. Y nada, entonces, millones de gracias por conectaros, porque eso os iba a decir, que teníamos como un mogollón de gente, y esta es la primera vez que lo hacemos online, y la verdad es que ayuda, ¿no? Tanta gente conocida y gente que nos empezaremos a conocer ahora, y muchísimas gracias por conectaros. For those who speak English, let me start in Spanish and then I will shift into English again. Just a couple of minutes. Hago esto porque nuestra speaker de hoy es Leah Zaidi, que ya habla desde Toronto, y por supuesto a partir de aquí vamos a hablar en inglés, sobre todo para hacer que ella se sienta cómoda y que entienda todo lo que está pasando, y porque dadas las circunstancias, pues os estáis conectando mogollón de gente que seguramente pues que no solo es de Madrid, sino de otras partes del mundo, y entonces para hacer todo un poquito más ameno para todos, pues a partir de aquí hablaré en inglés y lo haré pues lo mejor que pueda. Así que gracias por vuestra colaboración, y si algo sale de manera así menos esperada, pues espero que seáis un poco pacientes conmigo. So, okay, I'd like to share with you this presentation. It's a short presentation that we have prepared in order to explain who we are and what we do. And wait, sorry, yeah, that's the first mistake. Yeah, and I would like to introduce ourselves, saying that we are a local chapter and a part of a bigger project called International Design Futures Initiative, and it is an international non-profit organization based in San Francisco, and we are a very diverse network that, well, we aim to explore, debate, and work on all the topics regarding to the future. So, and we do it from a very wide range of perspectives, okay? So what we used to do is kind of workshops, talk like this, and well, among other things. And as you can see, we are people from different backgrounds, but we are all connected by the common theme of futures thinking. As you can see, we are designers, futurists, researchers, strategists, well, artists, whatever. And this is a very diverse community, and we are starting to feel like friends. These are the countries where we are active, and these are increasing a lot. when it started, it just was in the United States, and you can see how big we are now. And one of the best examples of a sort of event that Design Futures Initiative used to do is Primer. It's an annual conference held in United States and also in Europe about futures thinking and strategic foresight and also speculative futures. And well, here in Madrid, the team from Speculative Futures Madrid, we led the Primer Europe last year in October. It was amazing to have all of these people from all over the world, almost 260 people in Madrid for 2 days, attending to the talks, workshops, and stuff. It was amazing. And in case you miss the event, you can watch the talks online on our Vimeo channel. If you Google Primer Europe Vimeo, you can find all of them. So this is us. This is the Speculative Futures Madrid chapter team. So this is Ruben, Andrea, Milla, Lourdes, and me. And they are all saying hello. And besides being a team, we are also good friends. So it's amazing to be part of it. So in order to not to take more time from our speaker, I would like to share with you our social media channels, in case you want to follow us to attend some events or just to have some interesting things in online. And also, this is a main call. Sorry. Also, if someone has a topic or a project related to this kind of futures thinking and want to share with us, please send us an email. And well, thank you very much for coming and joining us today. And I don't want to take more time from Leah. So let me introduce you. Leah, I will leave my screen. So Leah is, well, let's see if you can see her. Leah is an award-winning futurist in her field based in Toronto. She's amazing, and she's the founder of a consultancy called Multiverse Design. Well, we will share with you all the link. And well, the interesting thing is like her approach is to combine strategy and science fiction in order to develop some kind of models or projects or pathways to help organizations to navigate change. And the things, the models and information that she's going to present today, you can find all of them in the website of Multiverse Design. So we invite you to check them later. And she's also part of another chapter of speculative design in Toronto. So it's amazing to have you with us. We are very grateful and thankful for you to joining us. It's such a pleasure, and it's amazing to be so international at the same time, as long as we are a local chapter. So thank you very much, Leah. And now I'm going to mute my microphone, and you can start sharing your screen and sharing with us your presentation, okay?
Sure.
And for the rest of you, all the questions, you can write them down on the chat, and Leah can answer them later at the end of her talk. Just a suggestion, if you can write them down in English to be, faster in order to answer them. If not, we can translate them, by the way, okay? Thank you very much, guys.
Gracias. I have to admit, I have forgotten all of my Spanish that I took in high school. So my apologies for butchering your language in any sort of way in this process. But thank you so much for having me to the Speculative Futures Madrid group, and thank you for joining me today. I'm going to walk you through some material, and we'll get started right away and jump into it. So if you're not familiar with my work, I am, for a lack of a better word, a futurist. So what that essentially means to me is that I do a combination of foresight, a combination of systems thinking, and the sort of unique angle that I have on my work is that I combine it with science fiction, which is why it's appropriate to talk about in the context of speculative futures. So I'm going to dive into the material. And what we're going to do today is we're going to have like a very quick intro to systems and foresight if you're not already familiar with that material. And then we'll go into talking a little bit about how and why I think this is a dystopia that we're experiencing. And then beyond that point, I'll share a document with you that is currently up on my website, multiversedesign.com, and it contains a modular set of scenarios. So there's scenarios that you can sort of play around with and either build upon or combine and use in different ways so that you can start to begin to explore what the future could be post-COVID-19. And then we'll leave some room at the end for a little bit of a Q&A before I jump off. So getting started, systems thinking is a field, and what it kind of boils down to, like at its core, is this understanding of the relationship between the parts in order to better understand the whole. And so when we understand how things influence and impact each other, then we can begin to understand where intervention points exist. And this is really important when it comes to things like addressing wicked problems. So very complex problems like COVID-19 or climate change. It's important because the nature of a wicked problem is such that any intervention in the system could mean that it has all sorts of unintended consequences. And some of those consequences can be good, but some of those consequences can be bad. And so sometimes we end up designing things that we think are going to have a positive impact, but because a system is complex and it shapes itself in interesting ways, and it interacts, the pieces interact with each other in interesting ways, it can be difficult to determine if what we're introducing is truly good or if it will turn out to create further problems down the road. And so the model that I touch base with that I think explains this issue that we're experiencing quite well is called the panarchy. Sometimes it's called the adaptive cycle or the eco cycle as well. And so think about this in terms of how a forest behaves. So when a forest first starts, it goes through an exploitation period where there's lots of new species moving in, lots of activity happening, new things are coming together. And then those species start to settle. And so we see dominant species emerge. We see some stabilization happening, and that's a conservation period. And then something might happen that creates a release. And a release is when things kind of get destroyed. So think of a forest fire. A forest fire comes in, it burns everything down. And then what comes out of that is something new. That's a reorganization. So something new doesn't necessarily mean it's better or that it's good. It just means that new configurations are coming together. There's new dynamics within the system, and then the system keeps cycling through this particular framework. So how this applies to COVID-19 is that I think with our systems, with our constructed systems that we have, so everything from the economy to healthcare to education, it's all going through a release period. So COVID-19 in systems thinking in the context of this framework is what's known as a revolt. So it is a fast moving event that comes in and disrupts the system. It forces it into a release, and then it creates the conditions for a reorganization. Now, whether or not new things come together is still sort of up in the air. It's entirely possible for the system, which remembers how it used to be, to go back to a conservation period. And so strategies like corporate bailouts, for instance, keep us in the state that we were in before, instead of allowing things to sort of fall apart and then come back again together in a different way. And so foresight is the other sort of piece of things that I look at. Strategic foresight at its very, very core is essentially the exploration of multiple alternative futures, the many ways in which the world can evolve, the different sort of possibilities that can emerge. And then once we understand how the broader context might evolve, then we can step back and think about, okay, what does that mean for us? What are the implications of, future 1 versus future 2 versus future 3, and so on and so forth. So that's the essence of strategic foresight, and foresight falls into the broader spectrum of future studies, which includes a whole bunch of other things, including science fiction and forecasting. So I want to be just a little bit clear about what the difference between forecasting and foresight is, because I think it's important within the context of what's happening. So forecasting is when we take, a lot of information from the present, usually from the past, because it's collected, observed data points, and we're inputting that into, some sort of framework or model, and then we're predicting what could potentially happen next. So what we're doing is we're taking a lot of information and we're narrowing it down to make a prediction. Foresight, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. So what foresight does is it starts with the future instead of, the past or the present. And it says, what could the future be? It could be a spectrum of possibilities. There's a lot of potential outcomes. And so once we understand what that is, then we work backwards to understand what should we do now in order to prepare for the futures that are emerging. So that's the difference between forecasting and foresight. And in the context of COVID-19, both are important, because forecasting is, the models. It's the numbers that we're looking at. It's the predictions around, are we flattening the curve? How far into the future will that take? And then foresight gives us more of that qualitative picture. How will life change? What sort of issues will emerge? How will people behave? And so you kind of need right now both aspects of the puzzle. Forecasting in general tends to pop up a lot in trend reports. I'm generally not a fan of trend reports, but in this instance, looking at the science, looking at the research, looking at the trends around COVID-19 is important. And so let's jump to talking a little bit about dystopia. So within the context of foresight and future studies, we tend to look at narratives quite a bit. And so in some ways, when we create these sort of prototypes of the future, scenarios of the future, what we're doing is we're creating a world. We're creating a context for people to sort of explore and understand. And in terms of COVID-19, I think what we're experiencing is a dystopia. So it's not a full dystopia in terms of, we're right here at the very edge of what a dystopia could potentially be. It's more so that it's a milder dystopia. This situation could be much, much worse. We could be looking at, for instance, a death rate of 10% of the human population overall. But what is important to sort of note here is that in contrast to utopias, which don't exist, dystopias do, and we're experiencing it now. We're experiencing it globally. Before COVID-19, the dystopias were a bit more unevenly distributed because, we had parts of the world that were fully experiencing the dystopia where other parts were doing better off. Now we're kind of all in a dystopia, but that still is unevenly distributed, right? So this situation that COVID-19 has created, for some people, it's okay. So for myself, for instance, I'm in lockdown and I'm not, showing any symptoms of having a flu. I haven't lost a family member. I'm able to pay my bills. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm okay right now. But there's plenty of people who have it much, much worse, who are experiencing this dystopia for all of its horrors. So we have to remember that even now, as we're going through this, there's a lot of people on both ends of the spectrum where, this problem is not evenly distributed either. And so if I consider, we skipped ahead. So if I consider what kind of dystopia we're experiencing, I think it's actually a cyberpunk scenario. So cyberpunk, is defined by Bruce Sterling, is low life and high tech. So we have all of the technology to sort of connect with each other. We don't have like the really fun out there stuff like sentient robots. But we do have technology, we are enabled. And it's low life because life is kind of settled down a bit, right? It's not as exciting right now. It's a bit more mundane. We're kind of separated from each other. We're experiencing isolation. And we've lost quite a bit in terms of, the lives that we used to have. So cyberpunk really fits that as well. And another sort of aspect of cyberpunk that kind of fits with the situation really well is that it reflects an uncertain future. So within the context of a cyberpunk story, the future is very uncertain, and it's hard to sort of tell how things are going to go and how they're going to evolve for the everyday person. And so examples of cyberpunk that I would look to right now to sort of understand the situation include things like Snow Crash. So Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, what we're experiencing right now, particularly what I'm seeing unfold with countries like the United States, is setting up really well for that scenario where you see, lots of marginalization, lots of wealth inequality and disparity. You see quite a bit of things like hacking and making. There's a lot of that could potentially happen as people become more self-reliant. These mega corporations that are almost mob-like that control everything. So there's aspects of Snow Crash that I think we're starting to see now. So it's a little bit ahead of its time, and it's events like this that can create a lot of destabilization and allow things to change very quickly and turn very quickly into something we hadn't expected. So similar to Snow Crash, this could be a transition point between where we are right now and a future like Blade Runner. And if I look to a story like The Expanse, if you're familiar with that, it's a story that begins with something that looks like a virus spreading out throughout the solar system. And, you have colonies on Earth, Mars, and in the belt and the Belters, and particularly what they go through in terms of hardship and sort of fighting for their freedoms and to be recognized. We're seeing elements of that play out, especially on the front lines of COVID-19 right now with the workers who are essential to what we do, but aren't necessarily compensated or treated as well as they should be. So there's a lot in there to pick apart in terms of metaphors. And ultimately, the reason why we want to look at dystopias is because not only are we experiencing one, but there's another dystopia that's on the horizon that is potentially much more catastrophic, and that is climate change. So when I talk about climate change, what I'm really talking about is environmental sustainability. So thinking about the environment as a system and not just one aspect of it. So in terms of things like air pollution, COVID-19 has been good for the planet because we've seen a considerable drop in air pollution across the world. And that's the result of, the world sort of slowing down and shutting down, and also cars not being on the road. That's been a big factor. But at the same time that that's happening, we're also seeing many more instances of medical waste. So there was a report that came out of Hong Kong that, talked about how the beaches, the parks, and the streets were littered with medical equipment like masks and gloves. So what we have to remember is that, the Earth is a self-regulating system that's highly complex. And even if one thing is improving, that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole system is improving overall. So with the context of climate change, there's an opportunity here to really learn from this crisis and understand, how it's affecting people, understand what strategies work, what don't, and then taking those meaningful steps to ensure that we mitigate the next one. And so in the document that I have up on my website, what I kind of put out was a whole set of modular scenarios. And the document is kind of full of tons and tons of lines, and I'll show it to you in a second. But essentially what the scenarios are is that they're a set of possibilities, not predictions. So they're not things that I'm saying necessarily will come true, even though quite a few of them actually have come true in the time that I released the document and now. So I released it on March 24th, and since then, certain things have already happened. But think of them as like pieces of a prototype. So when we think about speculative futures, which is sometimes based in speculative design, or experiential futures, which is, objects and artifacts and situations from the future, these are little pieces of what those could potentially be. And another way to sort of think about them is as signposts. So in foresight, what a signpost is that it indicates that a certain future is emerging. And so if we find that certain aspects of the future are happening more often than another, then we can sort of tell, well, maybe the future is going in that direction, and maybe that theme is the dominant theme. And so part of the reason why we do scenarios and why we look at a wide spectrum is because we want to understand what the unintended and unexpected consequences could be, the things that numbers don't tell us, the things that happen when, people are people. So let's take a look at that, and I can show you what I mean when I talk about scenarios. So this particular document combines a couple of methods. It combines Jim Dator's generic images of the future, and it combines a model that I created called 7 Foundations. And what it essentially lays out are the many possibilities that could emerge, looking at generic images through those particular lenses of the 7 foundations. So generic images include 4 types of futures. It is continuation, which is business as usual or growth; discipline, which is order and control; collapse, which is a systemic breakdown like environmental collapse or political collapse; and then transformation, which is high tech and or high spirited, so very positive. And then the 7 foundations category across the top. So I know this is hard to see. Don't worry if you can't read it, that's okay. You can download the document and see it fully there. So across the top, you have the 7 categories: political, economic, philosophical, environmental, science and technology, artistic, and social. And those 7 categories are what I think is the core essence of every system. So they're present in every system that we have. The question is, do we privilege some over the others? So for instance, we have a tendency in our world to privilege the political and economic over, for instance, arts and sometimes science even, right? So this kind of takes those constructs and those frameworks and then looks at, okay, so if we look at, things going as they always have, and the environment, what does that mean? What sort of possibilities might emerge? And so every single line within this document and within each of the boxes, so if I look over here, every single line here is a different possibility. It's a different scenario. And the way that I've been using them is taking them and, I could take one and I can extrapolate it out and I can think about, okay, what does that mean? So if I take continuation and philosophical, the first line there says commoditized panic. So what does it mean to commoditize panic? What are the implications of that? How will different stakeholders behave under those conditions? What are the granular details? Or I could do something like, I can take something from political and discipline and combine it with artistic and transformation and see how those two things might interact with each other as well. The other way, and that I've kind of been using this to think about the concept of signposts, is that I've been paying attention to, is there a particular theme that's emerging more than others? So right now, a lot of countries are in discipline mode, right? We're seeing more of this second row over here emerge. And that's because we're in lockdown. We're trying to, fight off the virus. We're trying to stop the spread, which means that we're having more order and control, right? Some of that is top-down control with the government enforcing policies, enforcing a lockdown. Some of that is bottom-up control in terms of, us not going out as much, us being a bit more careful with how we go out in public by wearing masks, by wearing gloves and things like that. So a lot of countries are in that state, but when we look at how different contexts and different countries are playing out, what we're noticing is that there's different sort of configurations across those four themes happening as well. So Canada, for instance, is a little bit discipline, a little bit continuation, but it's also showing some signs of transformation as well, because we instituted a relief program that looks a little bit like universal basic income. And do correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard stories out of Spain that Spain is also considering a universal basic income that could go beyond the crisis as well. And if that happens, then that has all sorts of implications for the future. In contrast to that, if we look at a country like the United States, which is behaving in all sorts of, horrible ways right now, unfortunately, they're seeing some discipline, but they're also seeing lots of attempts at continuation to go back to the things that they had before. So particularly with the economy, going back to work sooner than it is recommended, but it's showing some signs of collapse as well. It's showing some elements of the system being under strain and breaking down. And that's a reflection of what has come before it as well. So if we think back to the panarchy and that cycle, because the system has a tendency to remember what it was, it can be artificially held in place. And the problems that existed before, things like wealth inequality, poverty, the issue with gun control, all of that sort of stuff, these problems can be exasperated during a release period. It's straining the system, it's putting tension on the system, which means that things can go even worse. But all of these problems were there before. Now they're just, being strained and exasperated to a breaking point potentially. So some things to consider as we look across the scenarios. So I'm going to quickly share a few ways that I've been using it to put ideas together and think of new things. So for instance, if I pull out 3 different things from the document, if I pull up fear, new startups emerging out of this, and the concept of prepping, so being prepared for many, many months ahead of time during a crisis, we might get something like Pantry, which is a startup that helps you hoard. So you could sign up for like a subscription, and every 3 to 4 months, you get something delivered to your door that includes all the essentials that people want to hoard, like things like toilet paper that everybody's worried that they're going to run out of. You can see that sort of a startup emerging in a continuation scenario afterwards, where companies try to respond to what they're seeing and fill needs that have emerged during this time. So another thing could be, if we combine this idea of conscription, of being called up to do a job the same way soldiers are, and then, have real-time tracking, especially around the pandemic spread, we could get something like a minority pandemic report, right? So based on the movie Minority Report, where it's about predicting who commits a crime before it happens. So we're already starting to see this, right? Especially with cell phone tracking. Different countries have looked into whether or not that's technology they want. And it's very surveillance state type of technology where we can see in the future that it could have lots of implications for privacy. So if we do, you know, a minority report sort of situation, we could have pre-infection mapping, pre-isolation, you know, recommendations where before you even have it, before it even gets to your area, if you're considered to be vulnerable, you're put in lockdown. And then finally, you know, taking some ideas across from very different categories, you can get something like feudal lords with close-knit communities, which is very transformative, and come to something like city-states. So this idea of, you know, having local concentrated power as opposed to power at a higher level. So this is kind of playing out in a very interesting way in the US right now. California has declared itself a nation state, which doesn't quite mean anything because they haven't broken off from the US as of yet, but the language being used by their leaders seems to suggest that they're breaking away. So they're calling themselves a nation state, and they're going into negotiating power, you know, around medical supplies and things like that as a state, and will treat, you know, the supplies that they're able to make and, you know, acquire as exports to other states. So they're taking a leadership role and a stance against the federal government. So it's kind of interesting to see that play out in real time. So next steps, what can you do? So what I want to remind you, if you do use the document, is that it's just a part of the work. This is such a big and complex problem that, you know, there's lots of work that's required before. You need to understand, you know, the current state that things are in, but also the state that, you know, Spain was in before all of this happened. What was your industry like? What was your organization like? And what sort of context were you existing in the broader context? And then, you know, with this document, if you do use the scenarios, then you need to think next about, like, what are the implications of that? You know, what sort of strategies, innovations do you design to meet the various futures that could emerge? So lots and lots of work to be done still. And, you know, if you do use the document, please do cite it. That would be really lovely. And that's it for me. So that's it in terms of questions. You can reach out to me if you have any further questions. My contact information is available on the screen right now, so you can reach out to me through my website or on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So I'm happy to do that. And I'm going to jump off and take some questions because I noticed that they have been coming in very, very slowly.
Oh, Leah, thank you very much. It has been amazing. I mean, I have all of my notebooks and stuff full of writings and notes.
Good, no worries. So I have, I did record a webinar. Lourdes was in my webinar last week, and so if you want to review some of the more of the details that I discuss in the document in that, you can take a look at that as well. It's up on YouTube right now, and just, you know, type in my name and you'll find it. But I guess I'll jump into the questions now.
Yeah, I think they need more time. Oh, let's see.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, no, sorry. Let's see.
We have one.
Yeah.
P1, I found one that says, is backcasting a synonym for foresight? No, it does get confused as a synonym. So what backcasting is, it's a methodology within foresight. So foresight, because it explores multiple alternative futures, what backcasting does is allow you to think of a particular future state and then map backwards from that future state to the present, you know, what the pathway forward could be. So backcasting is like, let's say, we design a preferred future state. Let's say we're talking about the future of Spain. What should Spain look like in 2030 or 2040? And we say, you know, we've come up with an image that we really love, that we think is viable, that we want to move forward on. So what happens if we're looking at Spain in 2030, what happens in 2028? What does that version of Spain look like? What happens in 2025? What does that version of Spain look like? And so we go from the future and we step backwards and step backwards and step backwards until we get to the present. And then once we're done, what we have is a pathway forward, right? We have a way to say, okay, this is the path. If we now jump forward, having worked backwards, what does it look like to get to 2030? I hope that helps.
There is another question.
Mhm.
You say, hi, Leah. What key signals can we pick now to identify the paths towards the different paths in a given context? Where are you looking at?
Yes, so if you go into the document that I shared, you can treat every single one of those different lines as signals. So a lot of that stuff has, even within the past 3 weeks, already happened. And what it might help you to do is that if you notice, for instance, more things are coming out of discipline, more of the discipline ones are getting checked off, it might mean that more discipline stuff that's not in the document, more order and control related things could also emerge. So then you probably want to go look to see, are there more order and control signals emerging? Are there more maybe transformation signals emerging? And so it's one of the most challenging things to do in Foresight is to do wide scans, because you have to be scanning all the time, right? Taking in information, looking for things that are weird. And so the way I sort of describe signals that has been helpful for me to understand when something is a signal and when something is not is usually when you can say this one thing, this one story, this one startup, this one city, this one individual is doing something really interesting that other people are not doing, that other places are not doing. Usually a signal is something that's so far on the fringe. It's not been picked up. It's not a trend. You don't have observable data. There is no pattern for it. It's just a far off thing. The other place to potentially look, which I like to do, is look at science fiction, right? So right now I'm looking at the cyberpunk scenarios and thinking, okay, what is it that we're doing right now that resembles things in those stories? And that doesn't necessarily have to be a one-to-one translation, like that thing happens, so it will happen here. Sometimes you can treat the storylines or ideas in science fiction as a metaphor as well for what's happening. So not a direct translation, but like, for instance, when I look at a show like The Expanse, there's a lot in there in terms of the dynamics, the politics of the situation, the economic implications that are playing out as a result of this new virus coming in. And it goes all the way from like destruction and, falling apart of strong powers that suddenly become weak and shifting of those dynamics. But it also has a good metaphor in there for opportunity could emerge. And what does it mean when opportunity comes about? Because it means even in transformation, some people lose, right? Some people stand to lose. And we think that the future could just be this one single great thing for everybody, but that's very rarely the case that it plays out like that. So there's lots of different places to look for signals, but I think looking at a wide variety of sources should be good.
I want to say that these generic archetypes of futures are very useful for us as professional futurists, but also for the rest of the people to be aware and to detect at first sight what kind of context they could be living, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the way I think it's important to remember, like, so the way generic images are created is to think about how we think about the future. So it's not saying the future is this one given thing. You know, the future isn't only going to be continuation or only going to be discipline or, whatever else. It's saying that when we think about the future, we tend to think about it in these sort of ways. And so the reality that emerges is usually a mixture of all four. The question is, what configuration, right? Like how much discipline are we going to see versus continuation? How much transformation is possible versus, us clinging to what we had. So that's one way to think about it.
Well, we have more. So Leah, how do you use the ideas or narratives you create based on your scenarios? What for?
So the purpose really in Foresight for creating scenarios, like at least for me, is that I treat them as complex prototypes of the future, right? So once I create scenarios and I create prototypes of the future, then I want to understand, okay, what does it mean for us now if that future were to come about, if that future became a reality? And so by looking at a wide variety of futures in different scenarios, then what we start to do is we look for strategies and innovations that will perform well regardless of what future emerges, right? So I want to find future-proof strategies. I want to find strategies that no matter what the future is, they're resilient and they hold up. The one sort of caveat that I will add to that is that I think we probably need to think more about the system. The broader system that has to absorb all the strategies that we're creating. So historically in foresight, the work has been done for organizations, right? That's what strategic foresight is. It's the version of future studies that you apply in a strategy context, and usually an organizational context. So what we need to do more of to sort of avoid the big massive disruptions and inequalities that we're seeing now is to think about, okay, if we create a future-proof strategy, what does that mean for the broader system that has to deal with that future-proof strategy as well? And is the system equipped to absorb it, right? So for empowering lots and lots of for-profit corporations, that have their own agenda, that aren't necessarily thinking about the well-being of the system, that has negative long-term implications as well. So we have to think about both aspects, both the organization and the system that the organization is sitting in.
Leah, as we have more questions, let us know if you have time to stay or you have to leave. So you are...
minutes.
Okay. So the last one. So in what context would you apply this exercise, or what is the purpose?
So the reason typically that we apply scenario work is to design for the present, really. We're thinking about the future in long sort of cycles and planning for disruption before it happens, planning for big changes, planning for policy, for instance, on a longer time scale where, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. So within the next like 18 months to 3 years, not right now, but usually when things are stable, you can generally tend to, speculate about what's going to happen next, but then every once in a while, something will happen that will throw you off that can't be accounted for in the data. So COVID-19 is a perfect example. So good foresight work should have happened at least a year ago. It should have happened a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And there was foresight work that was done around the possibility of a pandemic emerging to the point where there's been documents that have outlined very specifically, it's going to come out of China. It's going to happen from the wet markets. We can expect to see it from bats. It will spread through the world through international travel, and one after the other, we're just going to see it, fall like that. And those reports have been right on every account so far. So what you do is that you consider what the possibilities are before they happen so that you can plan and prepare for those possibilities if they happen. So organizations that were, I like to sort of point out, organizations that had done comprehensive futures work would be doing better right now. Organizations that had done comprehensive futures work around climate change would be doing better right now too, because climate change and COVID-19 have a lot in common. And one of the consequences of climate change is that a spectrum of diseases are going to emerge, infectious diseases. We're going to be dealing with not just one thing, many things at once. And that's been noted. But if you look at the details around the implications around climate change, a lot of that is happening right now, job loss. Significant numbers of sickness and health and death. We're seeing, massive increases in domestic violence. All of those things were noted as issues in climate change. So that's kind of my stance on it, is that you do this work so that you're prepared should something go wrong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you very much. You have shared with us a lot of knowledge and content, so now we are overwhelmed, but it has been a very beautiful time regarding these turbulent times. So thank you very much. We are not going to lose these questions, perhaps in the next meetup or whatever that we are preparing, perhaps next week or the next week, next week. So we can keep discussing about it or whatever, but we want to thank you a lot. Well, this amazing presentation, and we send you a big hug without virus. And
virtual hug.
Yeah, exactly. And well, we are now a bigger family. So thank you to you all as well for joining us today. And yeah, as I said, perhaps next week, or I don't know, we have to discuss it. Yeah, Lourdes want to say something
Yeah, we are planning some other meetup next week, but also if you want to ask the question to Leah by Twitter or maybe contact her by mail, I don't know. No, don't lose the opportunity to contact her.
No problem. You can do that. Get in touch with me.
Exactly. So we send you a big hug and applause, a silent applause. And see you soon, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Take care, stay safe, keep your distance from the germs. We will get through this.
Wash your hands.
Yes, wash your hands.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.